People usually think of poverty as a structural problem, as a set of deficiencies in income, nutrition, schooling, or opportunities. But in recent years, behavioral economists have looked into psychological drivers of poverty, particularly at patterns of decision-making that tend to keep people poor, that are maladaptive. Within the standard model, we can explain faulty decision-making as a problem of overestimated benefits or underestimated costs. When people overestimate the benefits or underestimate the costs of their choices, they tend to be short-sighted. They impulse buy, they smoke, they overindulge in sweets. Everyone is susceptible to myopic decision-making, of course, but the results can be much more consequential for the poor. But it's more than this. One troubling hypothesis is that poverty itself, say because it induces negative stress, might in fact be one of the drivers of bad decision-making. If true, this would help explain the existence of a so-called poverty mentality, a mindset based on fear and the belief that one will never have enough money, or that circumstances will never change for the better. Carvalho et al. Ran an interesting field study to test this in 2016. In it, they compared the decision-making of participants immediately before and after paydays. They found that individuals tended to be much more short-term in their choices, more biased toward immediate gratification, during precisely those periods in which their experience of scarcity was greatest and their financial liquidity was lowest. One other study by Ronzini et al. 4 years ago involved an experiment to directly examine whether wealthy individuals also possessed a higher appetite for risk compared to non-wealthy individuals. To measure risk appetite, they had participants play a game known as the Columbia Card Task, or CCT. To play it, you are presented with 32 cards, all face down. Some of the cards will contain monetary gains of various amounts, and a few will contain losses of various amounts. At the start, you'll be told how large the possible gains are, how large the possible losses are, and most importantly, how many loss cards there are. You are then asked to start turning over cards one by one. This is what's called the warm version of the Colombian card task. Warm because you turn cards over one by one under live conditions. In the cold version, you would simply indicate how many you wish to turn without actually doing so. Anyway, the game ends in one of two ways. Either you hit a loss card, or you yourself decide you no longer wish to turn any more cards over. When Ronzini et al. Ran their experiment, they found no significant difference between the risk appetites of those who were wealthy from those who were not. Our contribution is to consider that it might not be a person's absolute wealth that drives risk appetite, but instead their relative or subjective wealth. The distinction between the two is crucial. Absolute wealth, like absolute poverty, is reckoned against a fixed standard. Let's say if you make $100,000 a year, or in the case of poverty, if you make less than $2 a day. Relative wealth, on the other hand, is reckoned subjectively, as one compares oneself to one's peers. What researchers have found over and over in the last 15 years or so is that relative wealth or relative poverty are strong drivers for all sorts of things, from decision-making to behavior to well-being. A good summary may be found in Pickett and Wilkinson's 2009 book, The Spirit Level. So, in our study, we recruited 104 students from around DLSU and individually asked them to play a computerized version of the warm Columbia card task. They all agreed to play, knowing that the only rewards they might earn were those emerging from the game. This table shows sample values for gains, losses, and probabilities. In the high version, 29 cards featured gains of 75 pesos each, but 3 would carry losses of 1,050 pesos. In the low version, 31 cards would feature gains of 25 pesos, but 1 would feature a loss of 350 pesos. We ran 24 trials per participant. But before that, we asked them to rate themselves on the so-called McArthur Scale of Subjective Social Status, MSES, a 10-rung ladder in which 10 represents the wealthiest individual they personally know and 1 the poorest. After the experiment, we had them fill in 2 other surveys as validity tests, and we paid them their proceeds from the game, as well as a 50 peso show-up fee, representing the opportunity cost of their time. The key finding is visualized here, and suggests a pattern in which those who consider themselves relatively wealthy, that is, 7 and above on the MSES ladder, turn over significantly more cards, or in other words, exhibit a greater appetite for risk. To validate this, we fitted several versions of a regression model showing the number of cards turned against the log of socio-economic status as the main variable, with several controls. Across several specifications, including naive ordinary least squares, Tobit to address the truncation of the dependent variable at 0 and 32, a robust finding for log MSES remains. Every rung up the ladder of subjective socioeconomic status predicts a 36.7% increase in the number of cards turned. That is, a rough measure of a person's additional risk appetite per increase in relative wealth. This finding is large and strong compared to the control variable we added for absolute wealth, that is, the quality of the participant's housing, or HDI, in the model. As with Ronzini's findings, the coefficient for absolute wealth remained both small and statistically insignificant. Our results support the view that when individuals feel poor, regardless of whether they are objectively poor, they tend to avoid risk and behave in the same way as those who are distressed and who believe they have only the smallest margin for error in their decisions. We also point out that an extra layer of robustness was built into the experiment, in that participants essentially played a riskless version of the game. If they turned over a loss card, their winnings simply went to 0. They did not have to pay the actual loss out of pocket. Still, this did not seem to temper their risk aversion. Playing the game essentially without risk of actual loss suggests the conservative behavior we observe is robust among participants who believe they are relatively poor. So it's possible that the perception of being poor results in some kind of hardwired or near automatic response, which overrides any attempts to calculate actual losses or prospects for loss. In conclusion, it seems from our experiment that subjective wealth carries robust explanatory power for decisions made under risk, adding to what's now a growing list of physical and psychological outcomes traceable to feelings of relative economic superiority or deprivation. It turns out that even if decision makers are not objectively poor, the belief that they are less wealthy than their peers can enhance a range of tendencies, including their risk aversion, even when faced with riskless opportunities for gain. Such seems the power of relative comparison in status seeking, a phenomenon no doubt worthy of further economic theorizing and testing.